Kia ora koutou katoa. If you've had anything to do with children in the last decade or so, you'll know the phrase, let it go. It's from a song in the Disney movie Frozen. It's ubiquitous in tamariki-themed waiting rooms, restaurants, and childcare facilities. In a Disney-esque style, the song is about self-acceptance and liberation, where the soloist, Queen Elsa no less, is casting off the crushing weight of fear, societal, royal expectations, and hidden shame to fully embrace her true identity and potential. It's an anthem of female rangatahi empowerment. It emphasizes gain rather than loss in the letting it go. In the spiritual world, though, let it go, or in Greek, kenosis, has a different, though related meaning. It's about voluntarily putting aside one's presumptions, privilege, even power, and putting them aside in a way that's hard to take them back, and then going into an uncertain, unknown future. So it's more about loss than gain. Indeed, if your motivation in putting presumptions, privilege, and even power aside is for gain, a transactional deal of giving to get, then it's likely that you'll not find what you're looking for. The spiritual life is not a transactional one. Those doing the mahi of following Jesus in order to get the treats will be sadly disappointed. Instead, it's more like the poem by Constantine P. Cavafy, how do you say his name? Cavafy, called The God Abandons Anthony, 1911, this poem. The Roman general, Mark Antony, way before 1911, on the night before his army loses to Octavian and loses the city of Alexandria, Egypt, has a mystical experience of the god Bacchus deserting him. God deserts Anthony. And sometimes in the spiritual life, the God we have known deserts us. Leonard Cohen then came along decades later to leverage Cavafy's poem for a song Leaving Alexandra, at the end spelled R-A rather than R-I-A. And instead of the subject being a Roman general, it's a heartbroken narrator losing a lover. And the loss of a loved one, regardless of circumstances, is also a spiritual loss. And then the theologian and former Primus, love that word, Primus of Scotland, Richard Holloway, one of the better preachers I've ever heard preach, playing on both Cohen and Cavafy, titled his memoir of faith and doubt, Leaving Alexandria, IA, which raises the question of whether God is leaving Alexandria or if God is fixed there where the Holloway is. Holloway's faith led him to the very boundaries and to those who dwell at the boundaries. In life, just as we have relationships we rely on and people we rely on, in which we give and receive and reciprocate love, so too do we have structures and systems, metaphysical and mythical, grand narratives and assumptions that we rely on. Foundations, you might call them. But then, like Anthony's God, or Cohen's lover, or Holloway's faith, they leave, or die, or crumble, or become meaningless for us. And there is loss, much loss. In the Christian world, we have these things called creeds. We believe, credo, I believe. And faith was said to be assenting to these beliefs. Our current PCANZ moderator is big on this stuff. Everyone should say the Apostles' Creed. And these creeds were first developed around the 3rd century to determine who was in, who was out, what was truth, what was heresy. So creeds in a worship service today, even modern creeds, can still act as markers of who's in and who's out. So if we wish to be inclusive in progressive churches, we need to be very careful with these things called creeds. Here at St. Luke's, by not reciting an authorized creed each Sunday, we are implicitly saying that on the spiritual journey, beliefs can evolve and change. In fact, they must evolve and change. Beliefs at best are like cairns on the trail, not the trail's destination. For faith takes us on a journey. Let it go then is about leaving the certainty of inherited fixed beliefs leaves the certainty of inherited fixed beliefs that inherently say, all will be well if you just stay here. Believe this, do as we say. And when we leave, as many of us feel compelled to do, and it often hasn't been easy, we venture off into the known. Faith is about moving on. As Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says, the courage to live with uncertainty. It's about leaving and loss. The story that inspires me when I think about such journeying, leaving what we know and what we don't, is the Abrahamic saga, Genesis chapters 12 to 25. Abraham's a significant figure in 3 world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. His story is that he risked letting go of what was in order to open himself to what might be. He felt a divine call to pack up and leave, a compulsion. Well, not sure where he was going. His neighbors probably thought he was stark raving mad. He chose insecurity over security. Packed up his family along with slaves, yes, he was a slave owner, and cattle, and headed out from his home in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Importantly, in a culture where land was life, Abraham gave up his land. The call, which Abraham came to believe was divine, was an insistence, a haunting disturbance, a whisper in the dark of night. Abraham's life is the first significant journey story in the Bible, and it tells us what faith is, leaving the known for the unknown, believing without the surety of knowing where one is going. Leaving and believing, almost the same. Giving up with no return in sight, following that whisper. And Abraham also gave up his gods. That divine insistence, that call, did not come from any local Mesopotamian deity. In fact, he didn't know where it came from. Came from somewhere inside, I would guess. Did not come from one of the gods he knew. All that he knew was that he was compelled to leave. When Abraham arrived in Canaan, now you've got to think modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, southern Lebanon. This land which he was called to, he did not try to impose his Mesopotamian beliefs on his new Canaanite neighbors. He wasn't on a mission to convert. Rather, he engaged with the gods and the culture of the place. He seemed to worship the local high god, El. Continually on the move, Abraham encountered El at traditional sacred sites of Canaan. The land revealed to him its own particular sacredness, and he came to respect this alien piety. And it's of note that two of the names of the Jewish God in the Torah are Elohim and El Shaddai. It's as if the spirituality of the land shaped the evolution of Abraham and spirituality and Jewish spirituality. Shaped his understanding of God and then the spirituality of his descendants. Syncretism, much maligned by those of a fundamentalist persuasion today, has been in our faith history from the very beginning. Quote from Eckhart, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me," infers that God is not a being or force separate from us. He's not a transcendent deity. Rather, Eckhart understands us to be in God. Similarly, holy ground is not one unique place, but every place. Similarly, there isn't just one temple, but every temple, to quote the New Testament, every person is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Everything is connected and woven and shaping us. Faith for Abraham was never easy or comforting. His fears are ever present, and from time to time would lead him to make bad decisions. That's the other cool thing about Abraham. He's not portrayed as a saint, as a, whoa, he's the greatest guy and everything he does is just so wonderful. There's also much loss for Abraham. For example, he never regained the land like he had in Mesopotamia. He didn't get a big farm. When he died, all he owned was a burial plot. Faith was not rewarded with surety. Rather, faith continued to be a process of facing fears, trying to find courage, and then acting with what courage he had, or failing to. So when Abraham, in the reading from today, chapter 18, in the Oaks of Mamre, he was sitting in the shade of his tent, middle of the day. He was a stranger in a strange land. When the visitors turned up, he didn't know who they were. They certainly weren't family or neighbors from his childhood in Iraq. It's likely they were not of the same religion or race as him, which tells us something about how we should treat immigrants and asylum seekers and others who happen to come by. The text also gives no indication that Abraham quickly had them pegged as divine messengers. They were simply strangers. Later, he would think of them as angels. Much later, Christian theologians, anxious to find evidence of a Trinitarian understanding of God in the Scriptures, impose a theology that this text can't sustain. These strangers were simply human beings. It was to these strangers that Abraham and Sarah, who seems to have done a fair bit of the work, what's new, you say, extended significant hospitality, treating them gracefully and respectfully, without any idea of who they were or where they came from. Sarah and their servants, slaves, made a lot of bread, 3 measures, 22 kilograms worth of flour. The inference is that this is hyperbole, deliberate hyperbole to underscore the extent of the hospitable welcome, and slaughtering a precious animal likewise. And although the text says Abraham giving orders and telling his wife, servants to make haste to feed the visitors, it's plain that this wasn't achieved in 10 minutes or 60 minutes. It wasn't like whipping out a packet of biscuits from the cupboard. I suspect the visitors sat under their tree, out of the heat, in the shade of the tent for most of the day. The visitors gave to Abraham and Sarah a blessing. Was this blessing a result of Abraham's faith, journeying into the unknown? Was this blessing a result of the generous hospitality offered to strangers in a strange land? Or was the blessing not a result of anything, but one of those things that happens no matter what we've done? And was this blessing at the time just a joke, a throwaway line that later became seen as the Word of God? Raises the question for me, when we sit down at a meal, when we've been invited somewhere and sit down at another's place, do we leave a blessing for our host? And what sort of blessing might we leave? A word of encouragement, a word of hope, a word of kindness. The blessing that Abraham Sarah had was the prediction that Sarah, though past childbearing age, would have a son. And in a patriarchal culture, having a male heir was all important. It meant your life would live on, your name, your mantle. Having heirs and producing heirs was all important. And yet Sarah had not been able to conceive. Although Abraham had given up much to follow the leaning of his heart and to journey into the unknown, the absence of an heir was one fear, a destructive fear that he would not overcome. So a large part of this Abrahamic saga from chapters 12 to 25 is about Abraham trying to rectify the situation, making a mess of it, and a mess of his family relationships. And Sarah conceiving did not help rectify the mess. For Abraham, in the end, he had 8 sons actually, but the first 2 were Ishmael and Isaac. And they were seriously at odds with each other. Both seriously damaged by their father, and both destined to pass on serious animosity and familial dysfunction. The other 6 sons were from a later wife called Keturah. So the story this morning is about being a stranger in a strange land. It's about acting generously, hospitably towards visitors. Hearing, despite the impossibility of it, the joy of a child to be, and thinking that this child would be the bearer of his immortality, when, note very well, Abraham already had a son and heir. His name was Ishmael. Abraham had great faith and great fear. Some beliefs, like Abraham's immortality, were hard to let go of. Yet letting go is this path, this spiritual path we must walk. So I suggest to you this morning that letting go is a way of talking about faith. Letting go of cherished ideas, beliefs, even hopes and dreams. And letting go of pride, ambition, control. Letting those you love find their own course in life, not the one that you might think is best. Blessings to you this day.